Good evening. I'm Peter Zimmerman, Associate Dean of the Kennedy School of Government, and I'd like to welcome you to the ARCO Public Affairs Forum. Tonight we're going to have an interesting and I hope spirited discussion. Who is laughing? What is this? I think we'll have an interesting and spirited discussion about the role of women in the military. Joining me here tonight are four distinguished panelists, each of whom you'll meet in a few moments. What I'd like to do is just outline the approach for the night and maybe state a couple of the issues just to get them out on the table. First, we'll begin with a brief statement, 5 to 7 minutes each, from each of the four panelists. Then we'll have a few minutes of response to what they've had to say, and then we'll open it up for questions, hopefully in about 45 minutes or so. Let me just say a few words about the role of women in the military. For most of this republic's history, women have had a very modest and subordinate role in the American military. They have been in roles such as nursing, in traditional clerical support roles, but this began to change with the all-volunteer force in the early 1970s. Then perhaps 2% or 3% of the personnel in the military services were women. Today that figure is closer to 10%. There's been a dramatic change in the role of women, in the career paths open to women, in the opportunities open to women in the American military. Indeed, today women drive trucks, fly planes, command ships, and as General Foote did, command military bases, and hundreds, even thousands of men in the new military. Now, the growth of the roles of women in the military is beginning to bump up against some constraints, and those constraints revolve around a major public policy issue. That issue is a policy enshrined in law which closes off combat roles to women. The so-called combat exclusion law closes off many possible avenues of command for women in which they would find themselves directly in combat roles. This means that this limits sharply their opportunities for growth and development in certain kinds of areas that are central to careers in the military. It means that some of the traditional paths to the top, the very highest ranks in the military, are closed off to women by and large. Now, our national policy in this area is more liberal than some countries, perhaps less liberal than one or two others, but to my knowledge, I may be corrected by the much greater knowledge of the panelists, none of the countries with which I'm familiar allow women in combat roles or permit women in combat roles. Is that correct? It's not right. Okay, I'm going to be corrected shortly. This will not be the first time this will happen this evening. Just to state the range of views, I think, and the range of issues that we may want to explore. There is a view held by many, perhaps some in this hall, that women don't belong in the military, that women are best suited for what had been traditional roles and support roles, that women in the military undermine the war-fighting and warrior culture of the military that's so essential. That's what the military is about. It's about fighting wars. It's about risking one's life. And that this is not a pursuit that should be open to women. There is that view held in some quarters. I don't necessarily identify with it. I'm not going to tell you what views I identify with. If you're going to have women in the military, in the American military, then there's a whole set of issues that I think also need to be addressed. They're issues of equity and performance and behavior. For example, if you're going to close off to women many of the traditional avenues of approach to command positions, if they can't aspire to lead the organization in the highest ranks, how do you create career paths that are fulfilling and meaningful and exciting, that will attract high-quality women to the military? There are issues around behavior, around gender bias, and around some very well-publicized cases of sexual harassment in the military. Now, one might decide that, now wait, what Zimmerman said a minute ago makes no sense. Women should be in the military. They should have every opportunity. We should open up all of the career paths to women. If women want to be grunts and foxholes in combat, fine. If they can meet the requirements, fine. After all, in many other life-risking jobs, such as police and fire safety, women have shown they can compete, and they carry weapons, and they risk their lives every day in the interest of public service. Now, somewhere between women don't belong in the military and women belong in foxholes with M16s sit, I think, most of the panelists, and I hope most of you. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first panelist. Let's see. Now, our first discussant is Dr. Martha Mullet. Dr. Mullet is a professor of pediatrics at West Virginia University. Of perhaps greater interest is her role as the vice chair of a committee that is called DACOWITS. That's a military acronym that means the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services. DACOWITS is a Defense Department-wide group of outside experts who periodically review the status of women in the military and report to the Secretary of Defense. Dr. Martha Mullet.
Good evening. It's a pleasure for me to visit your campus. First, I thought I'd start off with a little bit about, since I'm not representing pediatrics here or West Virginia University, and I am representing DACOWITS, I want to put forth the issue as it has been put forth by DACOWITS. This is a civilian advisory committee made up of about 33 people, most of whom are women, most of whom are professionals in some area of work, but not military related. In other words, we are working women, generally speaking, and most of us have had no previous military experience. We are not military brats. We've not been in a service, but we are working women, and that has allows us to understand a lot of the issues that are going on in the military as far as women's issues are concerned. We report directly to the Secretary of Defense. We don't report through chains of command to the Army or the Air Force. We report through the Defense Department and then back to the services. Now, as a committee member, one of the things I have agreed to do in my responsibilities for that committee is to make visits to bases of all the services and to meet with the women on those bases and hear what issues are important to them, and then to become a spokesperson for them through the DACOWITS to the Secretary of Defense. And in this manner, we come forth during 2 meetings a year with issues that we make into recommendations to the Secretary of Defense. For several years, and the history of this, I don't know when it started exactly, the DACOWIT's first recommendation has been that the combat exclusion law be repealed. Now, that law, that's a congressional law, and it really relates only to part of the services, Air Force, Navy, and Marines. Okay, the law only relates to those services. Coast Guard is a non-combat from the definition point of view. However, there are women in the Coast Guard, and they go do drug interdiction trips to the Caribbean, and they do carry guns and the whole bit. So, I mean, it depends on what you define as combat. But the Coast Guard is not in this. Now, the Army is different. The Army's combat exclusion clause is a regulation, an Army reg. Therefore, it's not law. This past fall, the DACOWITS came up with a recommendation to the Secretary of Defense and then to the Secretary of the Army that there be a 4-year Army test program to put women in all areas of the Army, in all positions in the Army for 4 years, and see how it worked, to see to get some data on how women would function in those roles. At the present time in this country, there have never been women in those roles that have been excluded, and so we have no information about that. Now, the definition of combat is a unit that seeks out, reconnoiters, and engages the enemy. Therefore, many of the jobs in the military are not that. It's only, say, in the Army, infantry, some of the artillery, and tanks. In the Air Force, it's like fighter jets. In the Navy, it is aircraft carriers and destroyers. But the support ships women are on, and the other types of planes that carry troops around and refuel, women are pilots in those. So it's really only those jobs in the service that are directly related to combat that are offensive and not defensive in nature. Women are in positions where they have to defend themselves, therefore they carry M16s as a defensive role and not an offensive role. So the Dakowitz came up with this, where they thought, the Army could do it because it's a regulation, that they could have a trial period and see how women could fulfill in these roles. Now, what Dakowitz feels is they want the best person to do the job, and that is someone who is qualified and who does pass the test to perform that job, and that should not relate to whether that person is a male or female. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce Elaine Donnelly. She is a Republican activist from Michigan. She's been the legislative chair there for the Federation of Republican Women, a national delegate from Michigan, and she too has been involved in Dakowitz. She was a member of Dakowitz from 1984 to 1986. Elaine Donnelly.
Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman, and thanks to everybody who had something to do with arranging this discussion tonight. This is an issue that is long overdue for discussion, and if we owe Captain Linda Bray anything at all, it's the fact that because of what she did in Panama, she put this subject on the agenda of public discussion. I'm not going to repeat all the news reports that you heard about Captain Linda Bray in Panama. Some of them sounded sort of like a made-for-TV movie. One overheated commentator said that her actions were worthy of a young Douglas MacArthur or George Patton. But alas, the saga of Captain Linda Bray, who I'm sure is a very fine soldier, the saga was too sensational to be true. There was no 3-hour firefight. There were no Panamanian soldiers on the floor dead. And it turned out that the young officer had directed her MP unit by radio from a half-mile away. She arrived on the scene there was about 10 minutes of unexpected gunfire, and the snipers faded into the woods, and the mission was over. Now, virtually all of the American soldiers in Panama did a fine job, and they deserve credit, including the women who were there, for a job well done. But the premature conclusion that Panama proves that women are now ready for the combat infantry, and that's what we're talking about here tonight. We're not talking about Top Gun airplanes. We're talking about combat infantry, particularly in the Army. To say that Panama proves that women are now ready for this job in a future war, a long-term war, such as Vietnam or Korea, that conclusion is just as overblown as the early reports about Captain Bray. Now, the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services, known as Dakowitz for short, it's an official committee, as has already been explained to you. We visit a lot of bases. I've talked to many officers and enlisted men and women all over the country. So although I'm a civilian, I know as much about this as probably more than most civilians would. And I want you to know that I respect the women in the military, and I understand to a greater degree than before I joined that committee, why it is that it is such a fine occupation for them. But in spite of my respect and admiration for women in the military, I remain unconvinced that the combat restrictions should be repealed. In good conscience, I cannot go along with that, even though the official position of the committee is indeed that all combat restrictions should be repealed. Now, whenever the issue comes up, somebody always says, well, as long as they're qualified, why not let women go into combat? Probably most of you in this room are thinking that. But you have to understand the definition of two key words. The two key words are combat and qualified. I'm talking about a combat that is more than the experience of being fired upon. It's more than the experience of being in a combat zone. It's more than a brief operation like Panama. We're talking about a small, very small percentage of direct combat jobs, such as the infantry and the artillery, jobs in which physical strength is important. Okay, we're not talking about commuting to the Pentagon. Combat missions, by definition, are not voluntary. All right, they're not glamorous either. The question is whether women serving in the infantry can fully contribute to the success of a prolonged conventional war, which, and keep this in mind, in the nuclear age, conventional war is much more likely than any other kind of war. Now, egalitarian theories abound on this issue about the interchangeability of men and women, but these theories collide with harsh reality and the brutal environment of a long-term combat warfare, like the ground combat experienced by soldiers in Korea and Vietnam. Warfare is not fair, it's not equal, it isn't even civilized. Women are equal before the law, but in physical strength, on the average, they have about 60% of the physical strength of the men, 80% if height and weight are the same. The difference is important when soldiers must move quickly with heavy equipment over rough terrain and all kinds of weather. Women have less than an equal opportunity to survive or to help fellow soldiers survive in that kind of environment. But most advocates insist that combat assignments will only go to qualified women. The problem here is that the word qualified has no meaning, and I'll explain to you why. I learned, much to my surprise, as a new member of DACOWITS in 1984, that there are physical tests that every recruit must take, but there are no physical tests that qualify or disqualify soldiers from taking certain strenuous jobs. The reason is that in 1982, a major project called Women in the Army, it has its acronym WITA, Women in the Army proposed a strength testing system for matching individual abilities to the physical demands of Army jobs, and they were ranged from light to very heavy. Now, this system wasn't perfect in all of its details, but it was a credible system. It was a good way to figure out, make sure we get the right person in the right job. Everybody here tonight is going to say, as long as she's qualified, let her have the job. The WITA system was designed to do just that. But guess what happened? The committee, which I was a member of, this is before I became a member, criticized the study and went after it tooth and tongue. Said that's not fair to women. If you have a system of tests that the majority of women cannot meet the same standard as men, that's going to exclude more women. That's unfair. It has to be gotten rid of. Well, unfortunately, a key decision was made in 1982, and the decision was that the strength tests should be nothing more than a recruiting guidance tool, not a qualifying test. That makes all the difference in the world, and you have to understand that if you're going to understand the issue of women in combat and why people like me have a lot of doubts about it. Now, this is not the case in Canada. You may have heard that Canada recently repealed its combat restriction laws. But in Canada, there were 60 women who tried to qualify for the combat infantry jobs that were recently open to them. 59 out of 60 failed to meet the strenuous requirements, so they did not get the job. They had to do other jobs, and I understand they're doing very well, but they're not in the combat infantry jobs. The importance of this difference cannot be overestimated. This persistent demand that we should have women in all jobs, even if they don't meet the same unisex standards, that's what's hurting the credibility of women in the military. I think that's a big mistake. Even if physical strength were not an issue, and we'll get into these issues more later on, the normal tension between men and women leads to other sociological complications in the military: sexual harassment, fraternization, the other side of the coin, inter-service marriages that complicate job assignments, pregnancy, and child care. All of these issues, all of these questions interfere with readiness, morale, and unit strength. American women have served in the military with distinction in previous wars, and they will do so again. I'm convinced of that. But military units should not be slowed down or deployed short-handed because some soldiers cannot march as fast, carry the same load, or are absent because of pregnancy or lack of child care. The military is not just another equal opportunity employer. Its purpose is not just to provide jobs or promotions. The mission of the armed forces is to defend the country, to deter aggression, and to deal with that aggression if and when it happens. The issue here isn't women's rights. It's national defense. The lives of both our men and women are too important to risk for the sake of social experimentation.
Thank you, Elaine. Now it's my distinct honor to introduce one of the few women who has made it to the highest ranks in the American military, General Evelyn Pat Foote. I know quite a lot about her because I had a quite extensive biography. I won't share all of it with you, but let me just mention a couple of things. She's a graduate of Wake Forest University, where she got a BA in sociology. She's also had extensive education in professional military schools at the Army War College, where she both studied and subsequently taught. She also picked up, I guess, a master's degree while at the Army War College at Shippensburg State University. She's a recipient of a very long list of awards and decorations, Distinguished Service Medal, a Legion of Merit, Bronze Star, and others. She began her Army career as a platoon leader in the Women's Army Corps. They don't use the term WACS anymore, do they? At Fort McClellan in Alabama. Toward the end, she commanded the 42nd Military Police Group in Mannheim, Germany. She was Deputy Inspector General of the Army, and she concluded her career as Deputy Commander of the Military District of Washington and as the Commanding General of Fort Belvoir, which is one of the Army's absolute star forts just outside of Washington, D.C. She retired on September 1st, 1989. We're delighted to have her here tonight. General Foote.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
You know, looking from my perspective over 30 years of active military service and hearing Elaine in all of her honest assessment of where we should be, I look and wonder, why did I do it in the first place? You know, the whole purpose of being as an officer in the United States Army is to serve the nation first, and to be responsive to the civilian leadership, which gives it its direction, and to do what it is required to do to provide the necessary defense for this nation. But then I hear a very nice individual like Elaine Donnelly up here talking about the military and the fact that women should not be in combat. And I think the thing that astounds her, and perhaps others, is that I do not argue the fact. I have never said that any man or a woman should be in any position in the military for which he or she is not totally qualified. And that means whether it's carrying a 70-pound pack on their back for a 12-mile march, or whether it's a person who must be very literate and very intellectual, whatever it is, you must be able to meet all of the requirements of that job. But you know, I look over my 30 years of experience when I came into the Army in 1960 as a lieutenant and went through basic training at Fort McClellan, Alabama as a member of the Women's Army Corps, because at that time, that is the only way that I, as a woman, could come into the Army as a member of a corps that was gender-specific, the Women's Army Corps. I was not a nurse, I was not a doctor, a vet, or anything of that type. I could not go into the Army Medical Department. So I came into the Women's Army Corps as a lieutenant. And I joined an organization that had a very marvelous sense of survivability because it was able to survive the demobilization of the Second World War, the very strong entrenchment of desires to reduce women from the military vernacular totally during the 40s and 50s and 60s, to make their presence so minimal that they weren't even there. And I survived because I inherited a marvelous group of people who said, we will be needed in the future because we're good, we're pros, and we know what we're doing. So I stuck in. When I came into the Army in 1960 as a lieutenant, my total horizons were those that were described not in terms of what I could achieve, but in terms of what I could not be. I could rise to the rank of lieutenant colonel by law if I were incredibly fortunate. I could command women. I could not command men. I would be a person who would be dealing within the Women's Army Corps as a woman who trained or recruited or administered women only, not men. In other words, I was to become a person who could deal out of the mainstream of the Army within a very small core of people, women, who since 1942 had recognized that perhaps the Army did indeed need women within its forces. And I chose to stick with that. Well, ain't it amazing? I commanded women at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. I was a company commander of a female detachment. And then 25 years later, I came back and commanded Fort Belvoir because times changed. I was a lieutenant in a training battalion for females only at Fort McClellan in 1961. And then in 1977, I came back and commanded an integrated male-female battalion of basic trainees, male and female, because times had changed. And in 1983, I went to Europe as a colonel to command a forward-deployed military police group as a female because I was the first woman to have that honor in Europe. I just happened to be the right person at the right time. And that unit had a very significant wartime mission to perform, had the need arisen. So I look out and I hear people talk about women in the military. Women are a degradation of military readiness. Women make men perform less. Ain't that tough? If they get so hung up on the presence of women that they perform less, they've got a problem that has nothing to do with the women. And I felt that when I commanded a male-female battalion that excelled in everything it did, because I did not judge my men and women on their gender. I rated them on their performance as soldiers. And today I hear to infinity that women make the Army less ready. And you know what? That's a bunch of crock, if I may say so. The men and women of this nation are capable of doing anything that they are required to do. I served in Vietnam in 1967. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I was there. I drew combat pay. The combat zone was 360 degrees around me. And I saw death. And I saw life of young men and women who wanted to do nothing but serve. But there were people out there who would like to have said that some of them should not have been there, either because of their race or their gender or some reason. And you know, I resented the devil out of that. Because these people are the salt and bread of what we're all about. So I hear us debate tonight the ability of women to pick up their responsibilities beyond the obvious, to serve as soldiers in combat or any other environment. And I say, so what? Does that diminish them as women? Heck no. I became far more of a woman simply because as a soldier for 29 years, I was required to do things and be more than the world would ever have expected me to be. And at no time along the way did I want to leave an imprimatur or an imprint of being more than a total woman in this world. And let me tell you, an American woman is one heck of a dame. When you push her to the max, she is one great person to have on your side. Women in combat is not a female issue. It's an issue of men's hang-up as to what women should be in this world, in an institution that is one of the last tree houses in the sky. And women do very well within that tree house. If I could leave anything to the military, it would be one thing: that I have done everything I could as a citizen to forward and protect the national defense posture of the United States as a citizen and as a soldier. And I have spent 29 years defending my right as a woman to serve the national defense. Heck, I'm tough. I got a tough skin. I laugh a lot. And I only wish that the men who are so hung up on the capabilities of women to serve within an area that they think is a male bastion is really something they shouldn't be so hung up on. As a citizen, the only thing I care about is, are we safe in America? Are we promoting the right policies and principles? And are we as soldiers doing professionally what we should do, preventing war? And secondly, I would say, it is about time that the majority percentage of the American population begins to intrude itself upon the national defense posture of this nation, where women have had no voice for too long. So will I continue to squawk and squeak? You bet your sweet bippy. So do I think women should be in combat if they are qualified? Yes. If they are not qualified, no. And if the men are not qualified, no. Only those who have the qualifications should carry that imprimatur. So thank you.
Brian Mitchell has the unenviable task of following General Foote. I think I'd follow General Foote most anywhere, if given the opportunity, General. Brian served in the military, in the Army, for 7 years. He was in infantry and in counterintelligence. I gather went through Ranger training. He graduated from the University of Cincinnati with a degree in English, and he's been a reporter for the Navy Times, which is an independent weekly that follows very closely the activities of the Navy and of the armed services. So, Brian, I should also mention, shall we mention the book? That's the reason why we're here. Yes, okay. Brian published, not Brian, but a book was published that Brian wrote in 1988 called The Weak Link, The Feminization of the American Military. I give you Brian Mitchell.
Let me start by saying that I still believe that honest men can differ, that people can have different information that they base their opinions on, that they can have different perspectives, different ways of thinking, and that good men can have different ideas about things. Now, there are some people, and it surprises me, but there are people who believe that if you don't agree with me, you're morally wrong and damned to hell. And I would like to challenge the audience here as we think about this tonight to think that not everybody who doesn't take the view that women ought to be in the military or ought to be in combat is insecure in their manhood, or is backward, or in some way just morally reprobate. Because there are facts out there. It's a broad issue. There are a lot of facts to consider. And anybody who sifts through the bit of sand in front of him can come up with different answers. Now, I'd like to start then by saying that we're not here just talking about combat. You cannot talk just about women in combat. The issue is really women in the military. The distinction between combat, what's combat and what's non-combat is strictly artificial. The services exist to do combat. The only reason they separated out some things that were combat and some things that were non-combat was because they were forced to come up with a policy to exclude women from certain jobs, to permit them in some and to exclude them from another. So they said these are combat and these others, on the other hand, are non-combat. In fact, you cannot separate the two. The same arguments that you would use against having women in many of the combat jobs, you could use equally against having women in many of the non-combat jobs. And it's not merely just an ability to do the job. There are many jobs in the military that women can do as well as men. Some they even do better than men, and yet there are other considerations. The services are large bureaucratic organizations. They have organizational concerns which transcend just the concern of the individual unit or the ability of the individual or the individual unit to do its job. And when you look at the factors of the way women impact upon the organization as a whole, you see that they present a lot of problems that the military really shouldn't have to deal with, or at least problems that do degrade from the ability of the military to accomplish its mission. Women have higher attrition rates in basic training, and the first term as enlisted personnel at the service academies. They have higher attrition rates. They've always had higher attrition rates. They have higher attrition rates as young officers coming out of the academies. They are many times more likely to be single parents. That's a real problem for the military. We're now building a lot of daycare centers to take care of those children. And single parents aren't as deployable when it comes down time to go to Panama to do whatever we have to do. Single parents are less likely to deploy. Pregnant women are less likely to deploy, less available for duty. And at any one time, the estimations are about 10% of the women in the military are pregnant. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot. You say just 10%, but if your unit, your 6-man section, has 3 women in it, and 2 of those are pregnant, you're at a serious hurt because of pregnancy and because of the military's policy towards it. It has to tolerate it. It has to say, oh, that's okay. You're a member in good standing even if you're pregnant, even if you're not doing your job, even if it prevents you from actually going to war and doing the job, even if you can do it. Women require more medical attention. They miss many times more days than men do for medical reasons. Some people say that doesn't matter now because men miss more time for disciplinary reasons and drug and alcohol abuse, and it's true. Women are better behaved. But when you look at the comparison, the only comparison available was done 10 years ago, and the rates of drug and alcohol abuse and discipline problems were much higher then than they are now. And if you ask the Department of Defense, they'll tell you that the rates of drug and alcohol abuse, the rates of indiscipline have fallen dramatically. If you did it in comparison today, you'd find out that women miss more time overall. But now let's get to the issue of, well, can women do the job? Well, yes, as I said, there are many jobs they can do, many jobs they cannot do as well. They simply do not have the physical strength to do. And we have, in fact, passed the point, well past the point in which we're using women in jobs they can do. We've assigned them, because we have no standards, no physical standards, to say, well, you can't go into this job because you don't have the physical strength. We've assigned them to do a lot of jobs they simply cannot do. And what we see is that it means you have to have more people to do the job. It means units aren't as effective. Somebody mentioned, I think the moderator mentioned earlier, that women perform as firefighters. Well, in fact, the Navy has a firefighting unit in Alaska that was so heavily female, they had to assign 5 women to do the job that 4 men are normally assigned to do. The Marine Corps does not train women to throw hand grenades because half of the women they tested didn't have the strength to throw a hand grenade far enough not to kill themselves with it. The Army, however, trains women to throw hand grenades and expects them to use them in combat. The Army has also estimated that 75% of the jobs open to Army enlisted men require more physical strength than 89% of the women in the Army possess. Aboard ship, and we have programs to encourage women to go into non-traditional jobs and to go aboard ship. And we have ships, in fact, whose crew is almost half female, and yet, when it comes down to common damage control tasks, firefighting, dealing with leaks in the hull, things like that, clearly, in some of those tasks, like handling a small pump used to pump water through a fire hose, virtually all men can qualify to perform that task, and virtually no females can do it, which means that if you assign women to those ships, you're making them less survivable. They're much less likely to be able to put up with what the Iowa had to put up with what the Stark had to put up with, the frigate, with what the Samuel B. Roberts had to put up with in the Persian Gulf. Those are the facts of life. I think it's terribly appropriate that we're here at the Institute for Politics discussing this, because politics has really driven the issue. It has not been for military reasons. If you look at any country in the world that's put women in combat jobs, that now uses women greatly in the military, they did so for political reasons solely. The idea that we need to afford women an equal role in society, not just equal rights, but equal role. If the military had been allowed to do what it wanted to do, we'd still be back the way we were in the mid-'60s. In fact, who knows where we'd be, actually, because for so long it's been required to do things without regard to the actual evidence. And you can see this. You can see this contradiction in what the military actually says and does today. You can watch members of senior representatives, admirals and generals with 3 or 4 stars on their shoulders testify before Congress and say only good things about women in the military. Say, in fact, that there's no reason, no military reasons to exclude women from combat. Some even say there's no reason to exclude them from the draft, equally with men. And yet, on the other hand, these very same men aren't calling for repeals of the combat exclusion. They aren't actually asking to put women in combat. Their actions are not consistent with their words. And the reason is because it's politically dangerous to say the wrong thing about women, to say the reasons why you don't want to put women in combat. But when you come down to it, and I was at the hearing the other day when the service representatives were pressed on the matter, why didn't they want to repeal the combat exclusions? Why didn't the Army want to go through this test? They finally did come up with a few reasons, many of which I've already mentioned. When you come down to it, members of Congress and members of the Pentagon know the truth. They know there are real reasons here. They know it's a complicated issue that can't be reduced to simple sentiments about somebody's 30-year career in the military. And that's why Pat Schroeder's bill will go nowhere. And you can watch and see if I'm right on that one. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. One of the hazards of being a moderator at the Public Affairs Forum here is that sometimes there's no controversy. And it's a dull, quiet, uninteresting discussion, and there's really no area of disagreement around which we can debate. Happily, that's not the case tonight. Let me first ask the members of the panel if they'd like to respond to anything others have said. Maybe start with Martha.
First to respond. Is this? Doesn't sound like well, no, I can project my voice in this room. Just a couple of issues that Brian brought up. Since my main emphasis on the Dakowitz has been one of the subcommittees that deals with quality of life, which is the daycare, attrition, and pregnancy kinds of issues among women. It is not true that the daycare centers are filled with children of single mothers. They're filled with the children of the male members of the services, of whom there are 90% are male. There are many of them married with kids, and that's where the children come into daycare. Attrition. You know why they attrit? When you visit a base, they're talking about harassment all the time, sexual and otherwise. I talk with women in a Marine base, and Marines have it rough. Women Marines, one woman and 200 men in a work unit. She's very isolated. She's probably 20 years old. This is her first life experience away from home, and she feels like she's in a difficult situation, and therefore in a couple of years she may not re-up. And so the percentage of her not going for a second tour is higher than men because of the percentages. I mean, overall in all of our services, it's 10% are women to 90% men, and in different units it's higher or lower, obviously. The last about pregnancy. Yeah, women do get pregnant. That's the way we get children. It's been the pediatrician, actually, I do newborn intensive care, so I deal with only babies. But it's been looked at extensively in the Navy. The women in the Navy get pregnant at the same rate that their counterparts in civilian life. In other words, the pregnancy rate for 20 to 23-year-olds in the Navy is the same as 20 to 23-year-olds in civilian life. So they're not getting pregnant more. They're getting pregnant like young women choose to. So they shouldn't be different. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other comments?
Well, the only thing I would point out right now, when we're talking about the capabilities of women, and dear Lord, I don't want to promote the ability of male or female in a combated environment, but there are documents when people tell me that women are so weak in a wartime environment that I go to find out that those who tell me how weak they are don't know what they're talking about. There is an excellent book that can be found in any good library called Women in War, written by a woman named Shelley Saywell, Saywell, who profiles the lives of 25 women in many nations in the Second World War who were not on the periphery of combat, but who were frontline combatants, resistors, aviators, those who were snipers in battalions. In the Soviet Union, more than 800,000 women in the Second World War who were frontline combatants, and they did well because many of them felt that for every enemy I destroy, I save a Soviet child or woman or man. So don't think that women, when pushed to the forefront, cannot fight for that which is right to be fought for. The women in combat issue has been resolved many times over. Women are dang good. And I'll tell you, when I was in Vietnam in 1967, the most feared soldiers to be confronted in the field were those female Viet Cong soldiers who were there to kill any American that they could. And they did a very good job of it because they were dedicated. This is not what we are all about. What we are all about is recognizing the fact that men or women, given the environment, are capable of any extreme of behavior that is necessary to promote or protect that which is important to them. And women are one heck of an infantry if you want them to be. I hope there is no war in the future that we are required to be that again. But if we are, look out, because the leadership will probably come from that area. They're darn good. But what we really are looking for are men and women who can recognize the fact that there are skills which can be applied within any environment to make it better and to promote its welfare. Whether it's a peacetime environment, whether it's a wartime environment, that men and women have skills to be applied, and it is a crime in any society that negates the fact that women should contribute as much as men, if not more, because they do a heck of a lot of it all the time. Okay.
Elaine or Brian?
Again, the issue is not whether we have respect for women or whether they're darn good. Sure they are. It's easy to say that. It's also an easy way to avoid some of the facts that were presented to you for your consideration. Nor is this issue about whether men are anti-women or not. I mean, I have not heard so much anti-male rhetoric since the last time I had time to watch the Oprah Winfrey Show. That's not the issue here tonight either. And by the way, there was a law passed in 1968 to open up career opportunities for officers, and I'm sure Pat knows that, didn't have time to tell you, but the law has an acronym called DOTMA. You don't need to know the name of it, but that was changed in 1968. Now, the question of whether women are really qualified, I would challenge anyone on the pro side of this issue to join me in asking for a simple change, and that is to do what so far the Canadians are doing. Prove it. If you think women really can do the same job, then let's have a strength test that has direct relationship to the job, and I'm talking heavy, strenuous jobs, not commuting to the Pentagon. Why not have a strength test that is sex neutral so that anybody who can pass it can prove that she's qualified, and then we can all be satisfied, all right? Until that happens, then I certainly have reason to be doubtful about this. And by the way, I talked to an air traffic controller once, and I said, what kind of test do you have to pass? Oh, and he went on and on and on. And I said, now, what if you don't pass the test? Then I don't get the job. Well, do you get it right away? No, I'm on probation. And what if you goof up while you're on probation? Well, I don't get the job. In other words, where life and death is at stake, you have a qualifying test. And if you don't meet the test, you don't get the job. That's not the way it is in the military today, and that's the problem I have with all this. Now I want to get into some of these sociological issues. 10% of military women are in maternity uniforms at any given time. Now, well, it's true. 10 to 15%, depending on which part of the country or which unit you're talking about, all right? Now, that's a fact, and no one can deny it. Now, a colleague and friend of, it is a fact, all right? All right, at the Navy base that I visited in Jacksonville, the percentage was approaching 50% in some units, but I'm using a low estimate, okay? Now, a mutual friend of ours said, Brigadier General, former Brigadier General said, when she was asked, do you think pregnant women should go into combat? And she said, yes, there's nothing wrong with pregnant women going into combat. Oh, really? Are the American people ready for that? What are the implications? Female soldiers out in the field disagree. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, if it's what women want, let them have it. Well, guess what? There was an authoritative study done of women serving in the field in Honduras. They're being trained. It was about 48 female officers and enlisted. This was in 1984. It's fairly recent. And the professor there, who was from Northwestern University, found unanimous agreement on this one point, and I'll quote him. If there is an absolute precondition for the effective utilization of women in field duty, it must be exclusion of pregnant women. Do you know that this issue is it's being handled in such an unrealistic fashion today for political reasons, as Brian said, that the military could not give me a straight answer. Would it cause more problems, turbulence is the military word used, to leave pregnant women or women who are less physically qualified in their jobs when mobilization comes, or would it be more trouble to take them out? And I never got a straight answer to that question because, quite frankly, nobody's ever done it. And if women are fighting on their own home ground in a defensive situation, as they did in Russia or even Vietnam or something, I suppose if somebody rolled a tank down my street, I might do something about it. Women are fighters, sure, if they have to, but we're talking about a different situation. We're talking about foreign wars, so let's get that straight here. About the child care problem, These days, military readiness depends not just on training, equipment, and intelligence. It depends on babysitters. Single parents are supposed to make provisions for long-term child care in case of emergency, but a recent Navy study found that less than 50% of the sailors are complying with that requirement. And by the way, the study that Dr. Mullet mentioned said, or she quoted what I was told as a member of Dakowitz, and I was really perplexed about this. She said that this is not a woman problem, that most single parents are men. But I found out after reading Brian's book, and I went and did my own research. I'm doing a thesis on this subject, so I went back to his original source. And I found out that the figures are being deliberately skewed in order to downplay the problem. And you know how they did it? They took figures that involved men without custody and compared them to single mothers with custody. And they said, see, there's more men than women. Well, you know that's not realistic. If the child is back stateside and the mother is a single mother and she's got a child that needs child care, there's a big difference there. So why are we kidding ourselves about this? There have been troubling reports from Korea and Germany about service mothers actually having to take their children with them when called up on short notice alert. This is a readiness problem. Demands for child care are quadrupling, and especially in these days of budget cutbacks. There are all kinds of other projects like libraries, commissaries, and the like that are being denied because of this demand for child care. It's a persistent and growing problem. Believe me, we dealt with it constantly on the Dakowitz. It's not going to go away. It can't be ignored. Now, we've been told that military women really want combat restrictions to be repealed. And I want to go back to Professor Moskos' study again. When he interviewed the women in Honduras, he found that half of the enlisted women said women should not be in combat at all. Okay, these are women out in the field. Half of the enlisted women agreed with half of the officers, saying it's optional, but that's not realistic. It can't be optional. Only half of the officers thought that combat should be mandated on an equal basis with men, but that was a view held by none of the enlisted women. So who really speaks for military women today? The difference of opinion, by the way, might have had something to do with working conditions. What these enlisted women are doing in Honduras, nobody in this room is likely going to have to do. This is not a pretty environment, and privacy is a severe and chronic problem. When I visited a Navy ship in Jacksonville, I asked, this is a ship that's a combat ship, and I said, okay, let's suppose the combat restrictions were repealed tomorrow. Where would we put the enlisted women and men? Now remember, officers have separate quarters. Well, there's no way that you could have even minimal separation between the men and the women. Well, okay, some people will say, what's wrong with that? But is it really all right for people who are not living in that situation to make that decision? Did you know that there are 1,200 billets on ships that are already open to women, and the enlisted women are avoiding them in droves? They don't want to get on these ships. It's only a very small handful of advocates for officers. And I say advocates for officers because I know many female officers who don't buy this routine either. This whole push is coming because of career progression and promotions. That's what the whole issue is all about. There was, oh, and by the way, the Dakowitz, it was mentioned earlier that Congress could repeal combat restrictions in the Army without actually having a vote. That's true. And I find that a little scary. I thought we had a democratic system. I thought our congressmen should be representative of the people. And yet, with pressure from Dakowitz, there were 24,000 jobs open to women simply by changing the word or to and in the definition of combat. The repeal of combat restrictions may increase jobs and promotion opportunities for a few military women, but a time has come for a serious analysis of the costs and the consequences, and especially the future consequences. Thank you.
Brian, you want to take one more shot?
I'll yield to the audience.
Question for the audience. Now, there actually is some agreement here on the panel, some remarkable agreement, because as both Brian and Elaine were talking about things like strength tests and rigorous tests for women who might want to go into combat, General Foote said, I agree with that, right?